listener production.
Hey, it's Helen Smith with The Briefing.
I, the keeper of the New West, welcome the destined one.
The destined one who doesn't even know what he's destined for?
Black Myth Wukong is the Chinese video game shaking up the industry, selling 10 million copies in just 3 days, making it one of the fastest debuts in gaming history. It's a AAA game, meaning it's a high-budget, highly produced product that can take years to make, unlike smaller indie games, which is uncommon within the Chinese market. Wukong is a third-person action-adventure game, similar to the modern God of War. But despite the game's popularity, it's had its fair share of controversy, with the game's publishers, Hero Games, asking reviewers not to discuss feminist propaganda, among other topics, while streaming. Harry Kalogirou is a freelance writer and game reviewer for Press Start. Harry, thanks for joining us on The Briefing. Since the release of the game, it's been purchased now more than 18 million times. Why is the game so popular?
I think there's a few answers to this question. I think that the biggest is its target audience. China's obviously very population dense, and I don't think there are many AAA games that explore, like, specifically Wukong, who is a character from a story called Journey to the West, which is very well known in pop culture there. And I think, adapting that story to like a big AAA game framework really resonated with that audience. So when the Chinese do find something, like, it's not often that like we see them big AAA games get picked up by that side of the industry often. But when it does, like, you see record numbers like that come through. And I think like the appeal that it has in the West as well, just in the way that it's like pushing a lot of the graphical expectations that the industry has nowadays, and that it just looked like an all-round solid game. Once like games like these start selling, everyone thinks that automatically means they're good, and then more people buy it and more people buy it. So yeah, I don't think there's like a one answer that sort of contributes to that, but more like a whole whirlwind of things that really worked out in the game's favour.
And we mentioned before how popular the game is and how many times it's sold. Is it actually a good game?
I think it's good. I did enjoy it. I reviewed it for Press Start. I don't think I liked it as much as what other people were. I do think that it's like maybe considered like better than it is, but like it's interesting to see how well received it's been by so many different audiences, like not just the Chinese market, but also a lot of gamers in the West were really keen on it as well. It is definitely good. I don't know if it will win Game of the Year like a lot of people are saying that it will.
And what does this mean for the gaming industry in China?
Yeah, I think this is the most interesting part of the discussion and like the impact that the game is going to have, because China has been like almost exclusively mobile gaming. Well, they have very rarely put out AAA games. They're working on, it's always like free to play mobile games that like really suits the Chinese market. All of them are playing games on their phones. There's so much money in free to play games through like microtransactions and stuff. But I think other studios seeing that a game like this can be that successful is not only going to get publishers keen on developing titles like that, but will also potentially quell any fears that they might have about investing really large budgets to develop these huge titles and not make their money back. So yeah, it'll be very curious to see how things shift over the years. The developers for the game Science, have already said that they are working on some downloadable content for Wukong, and they're doing another game within like the Black Myth brand that follows a different Chinese mythology.
The gaming industry in China is very interesting, and experts have said that the Chinese government traditionally views video games as harmful to the youth. What has changed? Why has this game been developed?
I think a big part of like the way that the culture has embraced it comes back to it being like Journey to the West. Like it might be something that a lot of the West hasn't heard about or isn't familiar with, but it is such a huge thing in China. It's had like countless movie adaptations, there's TV shows, there's other games. Wukong is a character that has appeared in so many different forms of media. So I think for them, like this is a story that like their kids get brought up with. I don't think any of them would not know who Wukong is. And so I think the love that it has for the cultural icon that Wukong is and the story of Journey to the West really does help the game in that aspect.
So despite the popularity of the game, there was a wave of controversy when it was first released, with Hero Games, the publisher, asking streamers not to talk about COVID, the Chinese games industry, and feminist propaganda. Why do you think they did that?
Yeah, that was a really weird one. I have an idea. So COVID, obviously, because of its supposed origin in China. The feminist ideology thing, I think probably roots from an IGN article that came out at the end of last year in November. So one of their writers, Rebecca Valentine, and one of their, I believe, Chinese co-writers did a piece on how sexism was pretty rife within game science and was impacting the development and the people working on the game quite a bit. I don't really think anything came of that. Like, it was more accusations than anything that got confirmed. But when they did a round of previews earlier this year and they had interviews, obviously some other outlets were asking questions about this, trying to clarify for confirmation, and they just sort of declined to comment. So I think the feminist ideology thing on those streaming guidelines definitely roots from that. And I think that comes from like a larger culture war that's happening not just in gaming, but all media. A lot of developers don't want to be associated with that sort of stuff and want to quell the discussion to avoid poor sales or the game being defaced in the public, et cetera, et cetera.
Going back to those allegations of sexism in the gaming industry in general, I guess, sexism isn't uncommon in the gaming industry. For example, I know female streamers often hide their identity when they're online to avoid getting hate. Why does this still happen in the gaming world?
It's a great question. I mean, even though it's been rife in the Western industry as well, like companies like Blizzard have had these massive investigations into them over like poor conduct against not just female staff, but other staff members as well. Honestly, I couldn't give you an exact reason why. I think like a lot of tech roles, it was perceived, maybe still is, as a male role, right? Like, and gaming is typically perceived to be a male hobby as well. I think the reality is that much like film and TV, gaming is expanding very rapidly. It's probably the biggest entertainment industry in the world now, and like there are so many people that play games. And I think, you know, for lack of a better word, the people who have been around since the beginning are gatekeeping in some ways.
Streamers who were also sent the game, like to review it and stream it, were also asked to avoid offensive language and fetishization while streaming. Is that a normal thing for makers to ask?
No, it's not. Very rarely do like publishers or developers have streaming guidelines once the game is out. If you get like early access or like a review code, as you would call it, and they say that you can stream it, often those restrictions will be pretty stringent, but they're like always pertaining to the content of the game and not necessarily how you're talking about it. So yeah, it's definitely a weird one. And because we haven't seen like a whole heap of AAA output from China, or like a game on this scale at least, it's all still very new. It might have been something that, you know, is quite commonplace for them to do. And it's just very odd to us because we don't really get that from other publishers or developers.
Going back around the rules surrounding how streamers were asked to play Wukong, is China out of touch with misunderstanding how streamers review and how that gaming industry works for asking those of the reviewers?
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, maybe they assume that because they're distributing code to reviewers, they can issue them some guidelines. The worst that's going to happen to a streamer in that situation is like a slap on the wrist. Like if a streamer is known for not being family friendly because they swear or like whatever else, they're not going to change that. Like that's what their viewers are there for. So yeah, it does feel a little bit out of touch. I think it's just sort of roots from a larger rift between like the Eastern and Western industries outside of like even Japan's business practices are very different from the Western gaming industry. So it'll be interesting to see if like China and Korea as well adapt to what has become the norm in the West, or maybe forge their own path forward in terms of how they distribute review codes and like promote through streamers and things like that.
So do you think this game has changed the way China views video games and how they'll produce them in the future?
Yeah, I definitely think that the government will start to see more value in them, like not just as ways that like they can make money, but also in the ways that it can help to bolster their culture. Obviously, like video games have a very like strong appeal to kids, and teaching them lessons through video games is a powerful thing. Like it's commonly perceived as being a waste of time or, not really amounting to much. But I think adapting a story like Wukong can really show the Chinese government that there is value in that, in the way that like you can sort of inform the younger generation and help them grow, while also bringing in big money for the country and those developers.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what happens in the future in the Chinese gaming industry, and we'll be keeping our eye on it. Thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing, Harry.
Thanks for having me.
That was Harry Kalogirou there, writer for Press Start. And that's it for this episode of The Briefing, but we do have the weekend briefing on tomorrow with the wonderful Dr. Karl and Antoinette Lattouf. They chat everything from OnlyFans to all of his failures in life.
I failed at being a politician. I failed being a physicist at the Steelworks because I said that the steel on the Westgate Bridge wasn't strong enough and it fell over, but for different reasons. And I failed being an academic in New Guinea because I wouldn't fake the PhD for my boss. And I failed at building my anti-gravity machine. That didn't work either. I did succeed in being a test driver for four-wheel drives. That was so much fun for 2.5 decades.
But that's it for now. Have an amazing weekend. But before you go, we'd love it if you could share this app with someone you think might enjoy it too. And hey, while you're there, if you could follow or subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast, it really does help the show, and it helps us find other listeners and keep making content that you love. If you want to keep up with our other content though, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search for Listener Newsroom. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.
Listener.